Hi, welcome to Patuxent River Park. Today we're going to take you on a journey. We're going to take you up the river and look at this magnificent river that's totally enclosed in Maryland. But we're also going to take you to our rural life museums to see how life was a number of years ago and what an important part this river played in people's lives. We're also going to head out to the Marsh Boardwalk where we can see the unique marsh and maybe some unique animals. And we can take a look at the marsh areas and the forest areas that enclose this park. Hi, I want you to take a look at this contraption up here. There's a lot going on, but you can see a flat space up there, and that is actually a nest for a very amazing bird called an osprey. Sometimes they're mistaken for eagles because they have the same kind of coloration. But these animals are totally dependent on water. And that's why they build their nests on the water. You can take a look and see we have some solar panels there. The solar panels are for us to use for scientific purposes to study these animals. We study the birds, the mother and father, mother will lay usually around 3 eggs, sometimes a few more, sometimes less. And she will stay on that nest with them, and dad will bring fish. They are excellent fishermen, and they will snatch them right out of the water with their talons. And they will bring it back to the nest where the mother will rip it apart and feed it to the babies. And one of the things we can actually do is look at this behavior because there's a camera. It's a game cam, and we can see how the chicks are doing or if they're not doing well. And sometimes chicks don't do so well. They have a lot of competition for food, and sometimes they can be predated on by other animals. This one is pretty safe. You'll notice a metal disc around the bottom of the nest. That metal disc stops other animals from climbing up that pole and eating the babies that are in there. Now they've already left. We call that fledging. The babies have fledged and they're moving probably to the Florida area. We band these birds. We put a little bracelet around them with a number on them so we know which birds are which. And the wonderful thing is birds generally come back to the same area again and again and again. So we get to know the birds by their numbers, and we see them come back and raise chicks the next year. So if you take a look at this area over here, you'll notice that there are very different kinds of plants as you move farther and farther away. Obviously there are big trees there, and there are some dead and dying trees there. Some of those are ash trees that have died in the last number of years from an emerald ash borer, and some of them are dying because the water gets higher. So sea level rise is very real. You'll notice that you have bushes. Then you have these other plants and these other ones that are referred to as spatterdock. But if you look a little bit further to my right, you can see plants that have almost a feathery head to them, and that's wild rice. And wild rice is one of the most important plants on this river. The reason it's so important is there are birds that come here and they feed off this rice. They may come for 2 days or 3 days, and then they fly thousands of miles to the south to their wintering grounds. And if that rice isn't there for them, they don't make it. So one of the things that has happened is the Schmidt Center has partnered together with 8th grade students to grow wild rice, bring it here, and plant it. And we've established so much more of this grass. And we've also put up fences, which we'll get a chance to show you in a little bit, that help protect this. It's a little bit different than the wild rice that you eat, something you may eat at home. This wild rice falls off and it ends up in the mud. And at low tide, these little birds called sorrel come up and they eat it. And it's really, really important for them. And if it's not here, again, they won't make it. So if you take a look over there, you'll see right at water level, those are fences. Why would we put fences in the marsh? Well, fences usually keep something in or keep something out. And what we're doing is we're keeping something out. A lot of the feathery plants tall plants that you're looking at are wild rice plants. And those wild rice plants, when they're coming up, are just tiny little plants. And we have what we call resident geese. We call them resident geese because they're here all year and they're here in the spring. And they would just go right over there and they would nip up all of those wild rice plants when they're tiny little babies. So they couldn't be able to grow up and feed those birds we were just talking about, the sorrel. So what we've done is we've kept the geese out by putting a fence up. Now I know anybody who's listening to me knows that geese can fly. But what we have found is they're big birds and they need a really long takeoff point. And if you'll notice, it would be hard for them to fly over. They have to run a little bit with their feet and gather momentum with their wings to be able to fly. And they can't get in and out of there and they won't feel safe. So they don't go in there and we have a lot more wild rice because of it. So you'll see this boat coming towards us. This is a motorboat, and motorized boating is allowed on the Patuxent River. You do need a boat permit to have a boat with a motor on it. But you can also take out a much smaller boat. At Patuxent River Park, we rent kayaks and canoes, and those kayaks and canoes can be reserved online. It has to be at least 24 hours. Obviously, they're cleaned out before anybody else gets in them. We give you a paddle and a life vest, of course, which I'll always keep on in the water. But these waters are usually pretty calm, especially in the morning times, where you can go up the river onto some of the smaller creeks. And it can get pretty busy. There's a lot of people who get out and are kayaking now. So you're looking at a dock, but you're also looking at something called a duck blind, and people do hunt on the Patuxent River. There are blinds where people would hide behind and shoot waterfowl, and those are ducks. There are not many here this time of year, early fall, but a lot of them are here in the winter time. The sorrel that I talked about earlier is a bird that was hunted quite a bit in the marshes itself, but not from a duck blind. They were actually from small little boats that people would use to push up into the marshes, and they would hunt them. And that's another reason that our poor sorrel was not doing so well. So when the numbers went down, and because people were hunting too many of them, and then the wild rice left, their numbers went down significantly. But fortunately, the numbers are back up and we're doing well. So if you take a look behind me, you'll see Mount Calvert. Mount Calvert is one of the oldest buildings still standing on the Patuxent. It has many, many lifetimes. Originally, it was probably even 13,000 years ago. We know that Native Americans lived there. We know that because we've done archaeology in the area and have found artifacts. Mount Calvert itself, the building was built obviously quite a bit later. It has had lots of different lives. One of the things that it was a town, and it was the town, the county seat for Prince George's County at one time. And it was also a tobacco growing plantation. There were enslaved people who lived there. We know all of this stuff, some of it from recorded history, but some of it from archaeological history. And Patuxent River Park does have an archaeological component to it, where they have looked for artifacts in that area. And times besides COVID, you can actually visit a beautiful museum in that house up there. This river is also historically important because of the War of 1812. The British literally came up this far. They were traveling up this river, chasing Commodore Barney up this river, and they landed at Mount Calvert. And one of the things we do know is they actually took 2 enslaved people with them, because the British said, we don't want these farms to be able to export so many things. So we know that 2 enslaved people, a man and a woman, were taken from this area. And the reason we know they successfully at least got out of this area is because there is a document, a court document, that sees them on one of the boats in Baltimore on the night of the Star-Spangled Banner. They were seen on a boat up there. And so we know they at least got that far and escaped from this area. It was the British who freed them, but the British came up here because they were fighting, of course, against the Americans. The British eventually marched on Washington and burned it. But Mount Calvert is a wonderful place to hike. You can get there by kayak, you can get there by canoe and boat, but you can also get there by road as well. And even when it's not open, you can still walk on the grounds, and they're really quite beautiful. So we're leaving the main stem of the Patuxent River and we're going up Western Branch. If you were back in the day, you could get all the way to Upper Marlboro. Now the water has silted in quite a bit. I've almost got a kayak to Upper Marlboro, and you've heard of Water Street? Well, this is the water that's on Water Street in Upper Marlboro if you've ever been there. So the wonderful thing about Western Branch is that it has marshes on both sides, and it has some tributaries off of the side, which are great places to kayak and those types of things. You can kind of get away from it a little bit. And as we go further up, we'll see the river will get narrower and narrower and more enclosed with trees. So you can see the ecosystems changing as you go up the river as well. So you can look at this beautiful marsh here. Marsh plants are really, really interesting because they have all different types of plants in there. It's a very, very diverse ecosystem. But this is a tidal river. The river comes in, the river goes out. And if we were here at a different time, the whole part right at the edge would look like mud because there would be less water. Walking through marshes are really tough. They're really, really entangled with plants, and they're really, really slippery because the water, when it rains really hard, this is one of the reasons marshes are so important. When it rains really hard and the water comes flooding through areas, it doesn't flood here. It goes into the marsh. The marsh is like a sponge and it soaks it up. And that's why these types of things are so very important to our ecosystem. These marshes have lots of plants, lots of animals that live in here, but they also help control erosion of rivers so much. And that's why they're really, really important. People have often tried to mow them down, fill them in with concrete, but what we have found is that channelizes the water too much and you get horrible floods. These are really, really important ecosystems. It's also one of the most productive ecosystems in a year. What do I mean? All of these plants will be gone in the winter and they have to start all over again, and they have some of the largest biomass and biodiversity of any place in the world, and they do it every single year. So we're moving up Western Branch, and one of the things you'll notice here is you'll see a lot more trees. It's not nearly as open as the main river itself. And if you look kind of straight up it, you'll see it starts to get narrower and narrower. We're going to head up there just a little bit before we turn around. There's another duck blind over there. It's in a little better shape than the one we saw before. And these are the kind of areas where a lot of animals take refuge. You'll notice that there are wood duck boxes and osprey platforms in the area. And so it's just a little bit different ecosystem than the open river itself. And because of that, we get a lot more birds up here. We'll get osprey actually nesting in some of the trees occasionally. But you'll see a lot of different diversity up here and just different kinds of plants. So we're moving up Western Branch, and you can see just ahead of us is Iron Part Landing. It's a place where people can stop when they're canoeing or kayaking, get out, have lunch or something like that. But it also is a place where you can camp. We do have camping sites. They're not all of them are open, but some of the camping sites at Patuxent River Park are starting to open up, so you can look at our website. This one is one that you can only get to by water, though. You can't get here by land. So a lot of history in this area as well. But this Western Branch goes all the way up to, as I said before, Upper Marlboro. And this was used as a waterway to move things from Upper Marlboro to the large farms that were down on the Patuxent. So you'll see a large concrete and steel thing in the middle of the river, and it has a lot of history to it. It is actually a pivot for a bridge. We'll talk a little bit about it in a second, but what happens is this used to be a railroad bridge right across here. And if we look this way, we can see this line of trees going down. Now this railroad was started to be built in the very 1895-96, and it took a number of years to do it. So why is there a plug looking thing in the middle of the river? Well, what happened was the people who lived upriver from here said, if you put a bridge across this river, we can't get our boats up and down. And here's the thing, back in 1901, when this was operating, people didn't have cars. And so what they used for locomotion and to get around was the river. So they said, well, you can't block our river because people live up further north. And so they had a pivot bridge. So a pivot bridge means that it turns from perpendicular on the bridge to parallel on the bridge. And there was a person who had to stay here and operate it so that the boats could move up and down. Large steamships actually used to move up and down the Patuxent River, and they would carry goods up and a lot of times would carry tobacco back down in these large hogshead, they would call them. People would roll them down to the edge of the river, and big steamships would pick them up, and they would go to Baltimore and be auctioned off.
Hello and welcome to Patuxent River Park. My name is Beth Mays. I'm a park naturalist here, and today we're going to be taking you on a tour of the Black Walnut Creek Nature Study Area, also known as the Brown Trail. We're going to see what we can see on a fall day, and then we're going to take you up to the Rural Life Museums and get a little history lesson. Are you ready? Let's go! So one of the cool things about this trail and why we love it so much is it takes you through a bunch of different environments. What we're about to enter is a swampy environment, and one of the neatest creatures or living things that lives here is called the bald cypress tree. This tree is designed to live in water-saturated environments where it's pretty much entirely in water all year round, or the roots are. So it has a special adaptation where it sends up these kind of snorkels, wooden snorkels from their roots. It allows it to get oxygen down to the roots that are usually underwater. This allows the tree to live in this particular environment year-round and thrive in it. So another cool fact about this tree is it's called the bald cypress because typically cypress trees, they're conifers or they grow cones, and they're typically evergreen. But in this case, it's a bald cypress, so it's the only cypress in this area that loses its needles over winter. So it's technically not an evergreen, even though it is a conifer. That's why it's called the bald cypress. Okay, so this part of the boardwalk gives you a really good picture of a few of the different kinds of environments. Over on this side, it's more of a swampy atmosphere or environment. On this side, you get part of the pond swamp atmosphere, and then you get the marsh environment on the other side of a beaver dam. So we had a family of beavers move in maybe a few years ago, and they put a nice dam right across this marsh environment, and that created the kind of a pond-like environment where it is no longer tidal. Typically when you have a marsh, it's tidal, which means the water comes in and goes out a couple times a day. Now that it's more stagnant or not moving as much, it affects what can live here both as plants and animals. And let's go see if we can see that beaver lodge. And we won't probably see the beavers, but at least we'll see where they live. Okay, so we lucked out and found our beaver lodge. It's over here to my left, your right. Now beavers, they move into an area and they can completely change the environment. They're nature's best engineers. So they came in, built their lodge, then built the dam, and they completely turned this into their little home. So what they typically do when they move into an area, they work really, really hard. And it's mostly at night, so they're called nocturnal because that's when they do most of their work. They chew the wood and they actually eat the wood too. And did you know that beavers are the largest rodents in North America? They're quite large, and they're a rodent, same family or same group as mice and rats. And they eat the wood, they chew the wood, they build their homes, and they have individual rooms for all their activities where they raise their young, where they eat, where they sleep, all that good stuff. But as I said, they can completely change their environment just by moving into it. We chose not to remove them because that's nature, that's what we let them do. We let them completely change the environment that they live in. So beavers are really cool, and hopefully maybe one day you'll be able to see one. They have to be out at night because they're nocturnal. But so hopefully you'll be able to enjoy seeing at least the lodge. Okay, so even though it's fall and you typically might see more animals out in the spring, you might see evidence that animals were once there. So high up in this tree to my left is a big hole cut out of the top. So what do you think lives there or might have lived there at one time? Sometimes in a swampy environment, you have trees that can't handle the waterlogged conditions, so they die. And what's left over is a tree that has wood that is soft enough for maybe a woodpecker to peck holes in. And so that is my guess that a woodpecker pecked a hole in there, used it as a home and moved on. But the good thing is that nature recycles its own stuff, and I'm thinking maybe a screech owl lives in there now, but we're not sure. But it's an ideal space, big enough for an owl to maybe live in, a screech owl, not a big owl, little owl. So who knows, maybe one of the mysteries, but that is one of those signs that wildlife has been there and may still be there. Okay, so I want to show you a really cool plant that exists in this wetland, and it's a great example of one of the functions and values of wetlands. The plant is called sphagnum moss, and it looks like this. And it may not look like it's capable of holding a lot of water, but that's why wetlands are so cool and so needed, because they can slow down the rate of flooding and possibly even prevent it by absorbing a lot of water all at once and then releasing it slowly, kind of like a sponge. So if I were to give this a squeeze, there's water that comes dripping out of it. And that's why wetlands are so important. One of the reasons why they're so important is because they help control flooding and gather a bunch of water, hold a lot of water, and then release it slowly back into the environment. So here at the park, we conduct a lot of different research projects on various types of wildlife. One of our research projects involves wood duck boxes, and there is an example of a wood duck box over to my right, your left. Wood ducks typically nest during the spring, summer season, and their boxes are a fairly nice size, and they have a unique little kind of cone-shaped thing underneath of it called a baffle, and that protects those eggs and young from predators such as snakes, raccoons, and things like that that would try to crawl up into the box and eat them. The wood ducks lay up to 15 to 20 eggs, and they lay so many because a lot of them don't survive to adulthood. So usually when you have an animal that lays a lot of eggs or has a lot of young, it's because a lot of them don't make it to adulthood. But that is a project that we work on. We have people who check the boxes, count the eggs, and make sure to write down what they find out so that we can keep track of their population. So one last thing I wanted to talk to you guys about is evidence that nature is always working, even when it may not appear that it is. So on this tree, you can tell that it's no longer living, and many times on downed trees as well, or trees that have fallen down, you'll see these interesting little things start growing on it. These are called mushrooms or fungi. This particular kind is called a shelf fungi. And what do you think that they're doing? They are called decomposers. They're eating away at the wood and breaking it down so it returns back to the soil. Kind of that whole circle of life thing. But they're always working. Something can always eat something else. And even though it may look like a dead log, it brings life to other kinds of organisms or shelters other ones. If you ever turn a log over, you might see a bunch of little creatures living under there. So nature's just always working. So this is one of my favorite spots on the trail, and I'll tell you why. Lots of reasons. One, you see this moving creek right beside me. And a moving creek has lots of living creatures in it, even if you can't see them right away. So one of the things I love to survey for are called macroinvertebrates. Macro means big, and you can see it without the aid of a microscope or a magnifying glass. Invertebrates mean creatures without a backbone, so things like insects. Macroinvertebrates put together mean big insects. They live in the water as babies, and then they grow up to be dragonflies, damselflies, things that live outside in the air and fly. So we won't survey for any of those today, but they usually live up in this leaf litter that you see because they hide so that bigger creatures don't eat them. Another thing I wanted to point out to you is this plant right here. This is called skunk cabbage. Doesn't sound that appetizing, does it? Skunk cabbage. We can't eat it. Deer can, other animals can, but we can't. Skunk cabbage is really unique because it emits heat as it grows. So the best time to see it in action is in the winter, especially after it snows. Because if you go check it out during a snow, when there's like a few inches of snow on the ground, you can tell where the skunk cabbage is because the snow will be melted around it. Pretty cool. One more thing I wanted to show you is evidence of beavers, and that they're still very alive and very well in this pond area, in this swampy area. This tree over here has evidence of beavers, recent evidence of beavers. So it looks like the beaver actually tried to chew down the tree. So we'll have to keep an eye on it and see if it comes back to try to chop down the rest of it, but you can definitely tell that the beaver's been chewing on it. So just because you don't see the animals right away, you can still find evidence that they've been here. So pretty cool.
Welcome to the museum area of Patuxent River Park, and there's quite a collection of interesting things that shows us life in especially southern Maryland. This is a Sears house. Many people have heard of the Sears catalog, and a lot of people back in the day got things from the Sears catalog because stores weren't close by and we didn't have Amazon. But this house literally was ordered the same way you would order something from Amazon. You paid your money and it got shipped to you. This is a house. Yeah, this house for about $400 to $450 was paid for, and it came on a train. It was in pieces, but they gave you directions on how to put it up. This is a small house. It has 3 rooms. Yes, 3. It has a kitchen, a bedroom, and a living room. And it's missing one of the other rooms. I'll talk about that in a second. But literally, people got this from a Sears catalog, and it was very, very common because it was affordable and it's well made. This one is quite old, and it is probably from the early 40s, 1940s. So the outhouse that's right over here would have been purchased for about $50 as an add-on to the house. You notice it wasn't attached to the house because there was no plumbing. Most of the water was gathered from the river or streams, and there's no shower in this house either. But there is a stove and some other really interesting things. So this is one of our other museums. We call it Working the River. People lived close to the river because of transportation, but they also lived near the river because of food. And right here, you're looking at a large duck blind. Yes, there are Canada geese on top, but people would get behind this and they would shoot at ducks and geese to harvest them for food. But working the river also includes things like oystering further south and crabbing further south, and of course fishing. And this museum is really dedicated to the people who work this river for many, many years for their subsistence. So welcome to the Duval II Museum. We're going to take a really quick trip through this museum, tell you a little bit about it, but we want you to come back and really see what's going on here. There's so many artifacts that Henry Duval collected from southern Maryland. He went all over and he got tools and all kinds of other facts to show the way people lived in Maryland back in the day. So let's go ahead in. Welcome to the Tool Museum. So when you come here, one of the first things you can see is kind of a guessing game. Guessing what implements are about, and the answers are under here so you know. But I'm just going to show you around a little bit. These are some of the tools that were used back in the day and were collected by Henry Duval all across southern Maryland. And you'll see a sled here, which is something that was used by people to get around. Wheelbarrows, and all of these barrels are made by hand by people called coopers. Horses were really big, and if you see here, there's some implements that we would need for horses to pull wagons or to ride on them. People would have to carry water from long distances away, and things like washing machines were really hard to use because everything was by hand. So as we go around the museum, you'll see a lot of implements and there's information, and we'd love you to come and look at some of these things in detail. We have a reestablished general store that would have some of the things that back in the day were really important for people to buy because they couldn't make them at home. If you look here, you'll see all this dental equipment. This is very primitive, and you probably wouldn't want to go to a dentist back in the day. So make sure you take care of your teeth. Thank you so much for coming with us on this journey through Patuxent River Park, seeing what wonderful things we have. We really like you to come back. So we're going to say goodbye for now. Goodbye to the marshes, goodbye to the buildings, goodbye to the river. But remember, it's still open and you can come here and visit us. Thanks.